tal? Bienvenidas, bienvenidos todos a esta sesión, a esta nueva sesión del ciclo de conferencias de lengua y cultura, organizado por el Centro de Autoacceso y Mediateca de la Escuela Nacional de Estudios Superiores, Unidad Morelia de la UNAM. En esta ocasión nos hemos reunido porque vamos a conocer un tema muy interesante acerca de cómo la poesía, la literatura, puede convertirse en una herramienta efectiva para el aprendizaje autónomo del inglés. También puede convertirse en un mecanismo divertido, atractivo, en donde vamos a poder explorar métodos diferentes, en donde la poesía ayudará a mejorar la comprensión y la fluidez en el idioma. En esta ocasión nos acompaña el doctor Jaime Chaboya McKibben, que es asesor del Centro de Autoacceso en el área o en la Academia de Inglés. Entonces, le doy la más cordial bienvenida y esta sesión será grabada en inglés y el público objetivo es para todos aquellos aprendientes de inglés intermedio, intermedio alto o avanzado. Es una manera de perfeccionar el idioma. Pero también, al finalizar, les tenemos una sorpresa en donde les podemos hablar sobre las opciones formativas que tenemos en el Centro de Autoacceso. Entonces, sin más, dejo los micrófonos al doctor Chaboya y me da mucho gusto saludarles. Y también en la caja de información de este video, en la parte de abajo, en YouTube, van a poder encontrar los medios de contacto. Bienvenido, doctor.
Muchas gracias, maestro Altamirano. Muchas gracias por la invitación a dar esta charla aquí a la comunidad de la mediateca de la ENES UNAM Morelia. Bueno, y no sé si puedo, ya debo de compartir pantalla, ¿sí está bien?
Adelante.
Ok, muchas gracias. Bueno, so welcome everyone. This, as you know, as the Maestro Altamirano was just telling us a while ago, this conference is going to be delivered in English, and it is intended for upper level English learners, and it's going to be based on poetry. So to start with that, what about poetry? It is kind of different. It is not the usual academic reading that we find in our textbooks, and it is definitely not the usual way that we converse, that we have conversations with other people every day. Sometimes we find a very archaic language or a very strange syntax. Sometimes the syntax can be even backwards, but that is part of the literary nature of building metaphors, of making things interesting, of using symbols. But the really nice part about this is, and this is good news for everyone, is that you should not be afraid of poetry. You should not be afraid of interpreting poetry, because usually poetry has no correct answers. And that is because the beauty and the meaning of poetry and of art are in the eye of the beholder. That is you and that is me. There are a lot of benefits of using poetry in perfecting your English. And one of them, of course, is to increase your vocabulary. And depending on what kind of poetry you are reading, you will be exposed to popular expressions or to even more sophisticated concepts or even archaic uses of words that are not very frequent anymore, but you get a sense of the history of how English has evolved as a language. Using poetry also strengthens your imagination and helps you to dream. It can take you to wild, crazy, exotic places and have fantasies about what is happening in the world that we cannot see, that is surrounding us, how to look at it from a different way. And because of that, we can build awareness of what it's like to be in the shoes of another person or of another being, how to look at the rain, how to look at the sky, how to look at society from a different point of view. And also, poetry is good for your health. It is shown in some different studies that book readers and poetry readers generally live a little bit more happier and they live a little bit longer. So There are a lot of good reasons to read poetry. I encourage you. Professor Eduardo also encourages you, and everyone here at the Mediateca encourage you to incorporate poetry in your English perfection. Now, the poem that we are going to see today is Howl. It's by Allen Ginsberg. It was written and published in the mid-1950s. And it comes from a movement in literary history that we call the Beat generation. And the word beat here, as you can see it, has a lot of connotations. It can be beat as in something harmed. You can say, John beat Luis and left him injured, right? It can also be as defeated. For example, the United States beat Japan at soccer. It can also mean beat as something in poverty or marginalized, what we can call in popular English, we can call them the underdog, which is marginalized or rejected from society. An example about using this is Joe is down and beat, implying that he's poor, probably unemployed, maybe even homeless, is having a very rough time economically. Beat, as for many people, is the first association is with music. And so it's doom, 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 doom. That is the beat. And also it can be the spirit of an epoch, of a time. It's like the spirit of the times, the beat of the times can convey the idea of the certain ideology and energy that was moving around society at a certain time. There's another meaning to beat, which is something finished or divinely complete. And we're going to go back to this meaning because it's not very frequent, but it was developed by the beat generations themselves. And I'm going just to mention it very quickly, and then we're going to see how it is important for our poetry example today. Jack Kerouac was one of the beat poets. You can see his name right here. He came up with the name Beat Generation after these poets became famous and newspapers and different TV shows started to interview them, asking them, "Who are you?" And Jack answered, "Well, we're the Beat Generation," not really understanding why. But after that, he had a revelation, a type of epiphany, where he realizes that beat is actually short for beatific. And that makes a direct reference to the Beatitudes, of course. And we're going to see that at the end of this presentation. So let's go to the context of the Beat generation. We already said that it's 1950s. It is a very special time in American history because we have just won the World War II, and we're starting a couple other wars. We're going to start the Korea War. We're going to start the Vietnam War. And we're having a lot of influx to the country of veterans that are returning after the World War II was over. We also have this expansion of the middle class and the development of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And society starts to react a little bit with these kind of things, with this contact and the way to understand the world. And so we also have a sudden presence of world religions and philosophy, a tendency for non-conformity, a rejection of things like the middle class and the American dream, especially for people that just for some reason did not make it or choose not to participate in those kind of things. That is the counterculture in which we find this poem, Howl. It was written by Allen Ginsberg and was first recited in public in 1955 in San Francisco at a very famous performance at a gallery called the Sixth Gallery. And it has a very impressive history soon after that, but we can leave that for another time. Howl is divided into 3 and 4 parts. It has part 1, which is a witness to despair and the rejected of society. The part 2 is dedicated to what is causing this despair and pain, this destruction. Part 3 is somewhat of a manifestation of solidarity. Now, it is a lengthy poem. It is a poem that extends several verses, and we will not review them all, but we will give you today in this conference a general overview and a possible interpretation of how to understand this poem. It is written in the language of the 1950s. It is also written in the language of counterculture. And just to help you understand that a little better, is the Beat generation is the previous one before the hippies. Most people have heard of the 1960s hippies. But before them, we had the Beats. And so in this poem, which opened pretty much everything for this generation to become public, we have a lot of recurring elements that refer to sex, usually homosexual sex or taboo sex. So also to genitalia, drugs, drug addiction, substance abuse. There is a very important element of mental illness and suicide inside the poem. And there are constant references to the multiple meanings of beat. Beat as in poverty, beat as in homelessness, beat in trying to struggle with the establishment or with the system. And of course, there are a lot of biographical references inside the poem and a lot of historical references that we will not go into today. We're going to keep it simple, okay? So we won't go into all those details, but we will just give you a little taste of what this poem is like, what it is about, and just as an example of how interesting it can be for you to incorporate poetry into your English perfection. So let's go to part 1. And it begins with one of the most famous lines of literary history from the 20th century. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. That sole verse contains pretty much the entire spirit of the poem. We will find this desperate call, like a howl, call, a testimony to suffering, to destruction, and not of just anything, but as we see here, of the best minds. The most precious parts of society are being destroyed. We see them dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. And we have there an example of 1950s language referring to substance abuse. Also, who poverty and tatters and hollowed eye and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz. Jazz was an important part of United States culture in the 1950s, especially for the underground culture, the marginal culture. the culture that was resilient to the emergence of the dominating middle class. And just if you are wondering, tatters isn't a good example of how you can expand your vocabulary. And tatters is a reference to fabric that is patched up. It's rough. It is worn out. So it's old clothing that have holes. So that's just another illustration on how poetry can help you to develop your vocabulary. More parts of part 1 continue with this description of how people are suffering. They walk all night with their shoes full of blood. Now imagine that. What would that be like? And why would a person have to be in this situation? At night, outside, lost possibly, and their shoes are full of blood. That means their feet are bleeding. They would sit in, but there is a positive side to this. Even though they were homeless and they would live in boxes in the dark, under bridges, they still had the capacity to rise again and to build harpsichords. And a harpsichord is a classical Baroque musical instrument. We will jump a little bit of this. We're not going to read the entire part, but this exam also gives you some clues on how Allen Ginsberg wrote this poem. If you are a creator and are interested in writing in English, reading poetry in English is essential. So how does he do this? He makes incarnate gaps in time and space. He uses juxtaposed images, and he joins them with a dash of consciousness. And with that, what he is doing is that he is recreating the syntax, and according to him, he is correcting the the poor ways of communication amongst humans. We're going to jump a little bit more because we're going to focus on all this other part in just a little bit. So let's go to part 2. It is the part where he says, what happened? Why are all of these best minds being destroyed? And in poetry, he says it this way: what sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination? Moloch. Now, if you are a history student, or if you've taken world history classes or religion classes, you will probably be familiar with the term Moloch. It was an ancient Babylonian, Assyrian, ancient world deity that humans back then would sacrifice their children to. They would seriously, literally kill their children in honor of this god. Allen Ginsberg calls him a sphinx of cement and aluminum that still somehow ate up their brains. Imagine such a demon, such a evil force behind the suffering. Part 2 describes this monster as solitude, filth, ugliness, as ash cans and obtainable dollars, as children screaming under the stairways, boys sobbing in armies, old men weeping in the parks. You can see from here why one of the main interpretations of this poem in general is going to be a criticism on things like capitalism, imperialism, materialism, consumerism, individualism, and all those other isms. But remember, the wonderful thing about poetry is that we can give it different interpretations. And so we are not going to give you the same interpretation that has been repeated over and over again. Even though it might be true and have a lot of justification to it, it does not close the possibility to other things. But it does become very evident here that there is a statement, there is a positioning of the poet to the great establishment, to the American dream. He compares Moloch to machines, to money, to armies, to oil, to electricity, to suburbs, to industry, to bombs. Let's go to part 3. This is the part that we said earlier, that it is dedicated to a sense of solidarity. The beginning of the poem, we did not mention this, but the poem is dedicated to Carl Solomon. We can make a whole program or a whole conference dedicated on who Carl Solomon is, but suffice right now is that he was a dear friend of the poet and suffered greatly from mental illness in a psychiatric institution in New York City. This is where Allen Ginsberg, the poet, yells out to Carl, and he says, "Carl, I am with you in Rockland." And Rockland, we understand, is an invented name for the psychiatric institution where Carl was admitted and spent several years of his life. The poem testifies to us that Carl, inside this institution, feels very strange. It is somewhere where the faculties of the skull no longer admit the worms of the senses. It is where he screams that he's losing the game. And remember, losing the game, he is beat. He is getting beat. He's losing the game. He bangs on pianos that make no sound. And he cries out for his soul. The way this part ends is this way, where we wake up electrified out of the coma by our own soul's airplanes roaring over the roof. They've come to drop angelic bombs. The hospital illuminates itself. Imaginary walls collapse. Oh, skinny legions run outside. Oh, starry spangled shock of mercy, the eternal war is here. Oh, victory, forget your underwear. We're free. Now, just to keep this in mind, remember that the title of this presentation is Sacrifice and Freedom. So here we have already a clue about which direction our interpretation is going to take towards freedom. The last part was added a little while after it was initially published or recited in San Francisco, and it's called Footnote. And the first line, the first verse of this section of the poem is holy, 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 holy. That's a lot of holies. It continues saying that the world is holy, the soul is holy, the skin is holy, the bums as holy as the seraphim, The madman is holy as you, my soul, are holy. Holy Peter, Holy Alan, Holy Solomon, Holy Lucian, Holy Kerouac, Holy Hunky, Holy Burroughs, Holy Cassidy, Holy the unknown buggered and suffering beggars, Holy the hideous human angels. Now, just very quickly to help you understand a little bit this verse here, Peter, Alan, Solomon, Lucian, Kerouac, Hunky, Burroughs, and Cassidy are all other members of the Beat generation. These are all writers. You will probably read. Alan, of course, is the author of this poem. And just another example, we have here Jack Kerouac. He is the author of the famous novel On the Road. We have Burroughs here, William Burroughs, who is the author of novels such as Junkie and Queer. So how does this all tie together? We have these four parts that are very different, and this is sometimes where, as an English student or even a literature student, we get shocked and we get dismayed and we get terrified by trying to find meaning and interpret a poem. But don't be afraid. We just have to make it a little bit more simple. Part one is obviously about destruction. It is filled with words that are related to suffering, starvation, hunger because of poverty, mental illness, hysterical, naked, burning, even though that they are in such a poor state, they are still passionate. We have more references of the symptoms of drug addiction, of being lost, of being homeless in the streets, of being injured, of being beat, and almost trying to give up. In part two, it seems like there is no hope, that the demon of Moloch that is behind this suffering is undefeatable. He is filth and ugliness. He is machineries and dollars. He is the world economy. He is children screaming in poverty, in hunger, in abandonment, orphaned. We have people in wars that are suffering to fight the interests of other people. We have all this because of to have the right to begin to build the American dream, full of suburbs, of industries, jobs, employment, income, powerful nations, and powerful weapons. And then it goes to part three, where we focus on just one single little case of suffering. Not the homeless, not the drug addicts, or this whole wide world or this whole universe of people that are suffering. But we go to the mentally ill, where everything is strange, where the brain does not seem to work in the normal way. If you look up mental health treatment for the 1950s in the United States, you will see that we have come a long way in some respects. Mental health is always a very complicated and mysterious part of medicine, and it continues to be today. And the history of treatment includes very shocking, very sometimes inhumane ways of dealing with things. So how do all these things end up here? How does it end up in everything is holy? The poet just said, destruction, woe is us. There is suffering and pain in the world. There is a demon eating our brains and eating our souls and our imagination. And it is unstoppable. How in the world do we end up with holy? Let's look at it a different way. In part one, we have a phrase that says, they're homeless people. That even though they are poor, they have nowhere to live, they still rose up. We have poets and artists that try to challenge the aesthetics and the ways, the traditional ways of doing poetry, of doing literature, of doing painting and music. And even though they were rejected by the elites, they still confessed out their soul. They were going crazy. They were in the streets and homeless. Yet they would rise again, reincarnate. And why? It was to declare something about the suffering of America. Into, the poet says, and Eli, Eli, lama, lama, sabachthani saxophone cry. Now, if you are a student of Hebrew or of world religions, this will be familiar to you as the last word said on the cross. In part two, where the demon is denounced, we find that it is not only the demon, but the people that created the demon. The creators of Moloch broke their backs, lifting their God to heaven, lifting their city to heaven. And in part three, we have the case of one man, Carl, who declares that his soul is innocent and immortal. And these three parts end saying, we are free. Let's go back to the meaning of beat. Jack Kerouac told us being beat is to be beatific. It is a reference to the Beatitudes. Now, just to refresh our memory, what are the Beatitudes? So if we go to Matthew 5 from the Bible, we can point out some of the Beatitudes, and right for this purpose of the conference, we're going to focus on these ones. Blessed are the meek, the poor in spirit, those that hunger, and those that are persecuted. These are all conditions of life frequently associated with poverty, rejection, marginalization, discrimination, and all of those ways of being that are not accepted in society. And that's where we can understand what Jack Kerouac tries to say when the beats are beatific. The beats are not destroyed because they will rise up and they will confess the suffering of America till they're free. And so in this way, we can understand that their suffering can be understood as a sacrifice for the freedom of literature, the freedom of expression, the freedom of art, and the freedom of the human spirit. So that is our presentation for today. And I hope you enjoyed it. We did not go very in depth, but if you want to go more in depth, you can meet with me at the Mediateca. I actually taken 4 different workshops. One is Introduction to Beat Literature, where you will find more beat poets. There's another one dedicated to universal poetry, more classical in style. We also have another workshop dedicated to weekly news that focuses on something that will help us understand American culture and government. And then another workshop about creating stories, which is where we put your imagination to fly and to make up your own fantasy worlds, all in English. And with that, I am pretty much done here with this presentation. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to our dear friend, Professor Eduardo, so he can continue this workshop here, or continue this presentation.
¿Listo? Muy bien.
Dice que esto es presencial.
Bueno, no, me da mucho gusto poder dirigirme a ustedes. Ha sido una sesión muy interesante la que hemos escuchado. Entonces, los invitamos también a que esta sesión que ha sido grabada previamente la puedan compartir con aquellas personas interesadas o aquellas personas que estén practicando su inglés. Como descubrimos hoy, la poesía, la literatura, las bellas artes nos permiten también conocer y aprender más y poder mejorar las habilidades comunicativas en nuestro camino en el aprendizaje de una segunda o una tercera, cuarta lengua, una lengua extranjera, una lengua diferente a la nuestra, incluso nuestra propia lengua materna. Entonces, ha sido un gusto poder escucharlos y poder haberlos tenido aquí acompañándonos en esta charla. Y no se olviden de que la próxima semana tenemos una nueva sesión del ciclo de conferencias de lengua y cultura, organizado por el Centro de Autoacceso y Mediateca de la ENES Morelia. A nombre de la maestra Karina Godina Sepúlveda, les damos un agradecimiento y la información de contacto de todas las actividades queda en la parte de abajo. Nos dará mucho gusto